So, as a self-proclaimed weeb who loves pretty much everything regarding all of the nerdy stuff in Japan, I was actually at a point where I was this close to moving to Japan. I was applying for everything and starting to get everything organized when I met a girl who later became my wife. And I also had gotten a new job, and I was like, I guess I'll stick around for a little while. And then it led to my life now. But I always had this idea of what I thought would make Japan amazing. And then some of those ideas started to fade away the more and more I got into it. My wife is from an Asian country, and when I started telling her like, oh, well, everybody's so nice in Japan, and there's all these like, there's so much respect going everywhere, and everybody's, very kind every time I visited. And she's like, yeah, but a lot of that's kind of fake. Like, people pull in, and that's just what's expected in public, but it's not like the people themselves are any different. It's just culturally, that's what's expected. In actuality, they get just as pissed as everybody else. It's not like they're raising anybody any differently. Or raising people to just somehow be different. It's just that they're expected to do something differently in public. And I had that moment of realization and thought, oh, yeah, that makes more sense. And then I started digging into it more and finding out all of the worst stuff about Japan that would have been a lot less fun to deal with if I had already moved there. Granted, I still think it's an amazing place. I would love to live there in some respects, but the nationalism and pure, like, not a huge fan of foreigners and all the issues they deal with that way, and all the other stuff I've seen around work culture especially sounds pretty rough. But there's an entire video about the lost generation in the dark side of Japan that I'm very curious to dive into.
If you look at Japan from the outside, you'll see this. Robots, advanced tech, basically zero crime, incredible culture, the third biggest economy in the world, healthy population, and companies that are famous all over the world. In many ways, an ideal.
And I am also somebody who drives a Toyota because they are far more reliable than a lot of other cars. But I just had to call that out because I saw the car manufacturers.
Country. But if you look closer, under the surface, you'll see that while all of that is true, there is another, much darker side to the life in Japan. Unbeknownst to most of the world, Japan has millions of people who have failed to succeed in the society and ended up completely isolated from it, without access to jobs, marriages, and means to live a normal and happy life. They are known as the lost generation, and they make up almost 15% of the population of the country. And their sad story is a symbol of Japan's fall from grace, and a sign of its disturbing future. This is the dark side of Japan, the lost generation. While this is now mostly forgotten, in the 1980s, Japan was seen as the next economic superpower that was going to replace the United States and completely take over the global economy. In a similar way we might see China today. It seems so certain that there was a serious anxiety about Japan in the US, with articles like this one, talking about an economic Pearl Harbor and how Japan is going to buy the entire United States, and with movies like
there was even there was even issues where people were taking Japanese-made cars in the U.S. and just destroying them for like public appeal, and there was like politicians doing the same thing because it would earn them political points with the public, just because everybody was like so worried about Japan destroying our economy, which never wound up being that big of an issue.
Die Hard, Rising Sun, and Blade Runner, all featuring the trope of Japanese corporations taking over America and the world. This anxiety was the result of the Japanese miracle. 3 decades of enormous consecutive economic growth, made possible by the unique Japanese economic system that was, at the time, seen as superior to the Western model. Basically, it was based on cooperation between gigantic corporate cartels and the Japanese government. These cartels, called keiraku, keiretsu were basically alliances of the biggest Japanese corporations, owning shares in each other and, while formally independent, working together to back each other up. And the biggest keiretsu were given unfair support from the government in the form of enormous loans distributed by the state-owned National Bank of Japan.
That's definitely something that sounds like it would never work long term.
This basically meant that these alliances had access to an infinite stream of cash to finance their aggressive expansion abroad, while at the same time, the government would block foreign companies from expanding into the Japanese market. It wasn't a healthy system or a fair one, but it was working. The Japanese stock market was booming, Japanese products were conquering one market after another, and regular people knew that if they worked hard and got a university degree, they would get a solid job at a large corporation that would mean the guarantee of a lifetime employment. Japan was unstoppable and everything was going great. Until it wasn't. By 1991, Japan had been growing extremely fast for 3 consecutive decades, and it became the second biggest economy after the United States. As the economy was growing, prices of real estate and values of companies listed on the stock market were growing as well, but by the
Although nowadays Japan has a unique way of how they handle real estate that makes it so it doesn't skyrocket in the same way as it does for us. I mean, granted, they have a declining population, so that's not going to be as much of an issue anyways, because you can always find more real estate if there's less people to fulfill it. But there's also this idea that like they always want a newer building, so older buildings don't sell at the same way. So it's very common to like have a piece of property only last a certain period of time. They knock it down, build something new, which in the US, it's not really seen that way. And even in the US, a lot of our buildings are not built with great quality now. So you can't really have that unless you have a lot of standardization, which I know they do have in Japan. And we don't always have the same standards in the US for a lot of our stuff, unfortunately.
By the end of the 1980s, this growth went into an overdrive and turned into a speculative mania. Basically, everyone thought that the economic boom and the growth of assets will continue forever, and the more you invest, the more money you will make. And meanwhile, the National Bank of Japan continued to print out and lend money to basically anyone who asked, regardless of what the money was for or how trustworthy the creditors were. And then one day, the bubble popped. Throughout the year 1990, the stock market fell by 43%, and real estate prices followed. The bursting of the bubble meant that regular people had much less money to spend, and that
if you prop everything up in an unfair, unhealthy way, it becomes a bubble and bubbles pop. That's how it works.
no one was willing to invest in Japanese companies anymore, leading to an end of the economic boom. On top of that, in the years after the burst of bubble, cracks in the Japanese system quickly began to show. It was revealed that corruption was widespread and common in Japanese business and government, from insider trading to stock manipulation and fraud and bribery, and that the practically
there was a huge issue for a while. I think there was like a thing with Japanese housewives trading or doing currency exchange or currency trading, where they would borrow money really cheap in one spot, then they would invest it in a different market and then reap all the benefits, but then that suddenly all collapses if you do it too much, and it was this huge issue.
Unlimited supply of loans created hundreds of zombie companies. Businesses that would have gone bankrupt years ago, but that kept surviving on never-ending supply of cheap money borrowed.
Yeah, and this is also what more recently happened with the real estate in China, with all of the like ghost cities and the crazy amount that they were just cranking money into it and investing into it, despite the fact that there wasn't anything to actually back up the idea of those investments. And then all of a sudden it comes crashing down and almost destroyed the global market to the point that it had to be propped back up. And now who knows what's actually happening there, because all the information gets fed through the CCP and they're not exactly the most trustworthy source.
from the state. In one decade, Japan went from being called an economic tiger riding the Japanese miracle to being called the sick man of Asia. But while this was a drastic downfall, it wasn't that unique. Economies of different countries go up and down, and that's part of life. But in Japan, it was different. Unlike in other countries, the economic downturn in Japan had devastating effects for a whole generation. Effects that millions of people have never recovered from. So why was that? Well, in order to answer that, we need to understand the Japanese work and hiring culture, which is, to put it mildly, very intense. And it has several unique aspects that make it quite different from any other job market in the world. A corporate career in Japan starts with Shushoku Katsudo, a unique Japanese job hunting ritual that university graduates go through at the end of their studies. Many companies, including the biggest Keiretsu, hire only fresh graduates.
Everyone has the exact same suit on. Like every student, the women don't have a tie, the men do, but other than that, it is exactly the same.
Graduates, and only once a year, but in mass. Loads of people at once. The fresh graduates pass the job hunting ritual, filled with group interviews and seminars that thousands of people dressed in identical black and white suits have to go through. And at the end of it, they get a job. And they keep that job for decades until retirement, in line with another common policy known as Shushin Koyo, or lifetime employment. And their company will then only promote from within, a policy known as Shanai Shoshin, grooming and cultivating their employees throughout their career to become.
So only promoting from within isn't entirely bad, but only promoting from within is a bit of an issue. So promoting from within is great. McDonald's used to do it, but I just watched a video and reacted to it about why fast food is getting so expensive. And McDonald's had recently hired a CEO from outside the company for the first time in like the company's history, which was crazy. And they've made a whole bunch of decisions that some people don't necessarily agree with. But I think promoting from within is good. But the idea that like lifetime employment can be a bit of an issue, because it becomes now that firing becomes a bit of a red flag within Japanese companies. And I've heard stories about Americans go to Japan and they will, or other Westerners, not just Americans, they go to Japan, they work for a Japanese company. That Japanese company expects you to work insane hours, follow all of their work culture, whether they're healthy or not, where it's like, work crazy hours, you go out drinking with your boss afterwards, and it's all expected. If you don't do that, they penalize you, but they can't penalize you with pay, and they can't just fire you. So the way they penalize you is by giving you less work. In Japan, that is something you want to rectify. You want more work to do, right? In the rest of the world, if we don't have more work, we're just not going to do it. Like, you don't give us more work, okay, then I don't have more work to do. I'm done. That's it. And so there's been issues where Westerners are there, they're given less and less work as a penalty, but then eventually they essentially go to work and have nothing to do. So they just like go and hang out, and they're totally fine with it because they're still getting a paycheck. And that's what they see the job as. It's just a paycheck. But culturally, it like doesn't mix.
Become future executives one day. These practices, which were basically the universal standard in the 1990s and are still very common in Japan to this day, bring stability, but they also create an incredibly rigid job market. If you want to get a good job, you have one shot after university, and once you are hired, you stick with a company for the rest of your career. But if you fail to do that, you are left out in the cold. And the doors of most companies will remain closed to you forever. But the point is that when the economic bubble burst and the economic boom ended, this ritual was broken. While during the boom...
So they essentially have one shot at everything, because I know there's an insane amount of pressure about the like national exams that happen for students. So you have to have one shot at this national exam, and then you have one shot to get a job after you graduate. And then that's it. Your entire life is set in stone. So no wonder there's so much insane pressure and stress around this that makes people go nuts.
It was not that hard to get at least some corporate job. After 1990, most companies froze their hiring entirely for almost the entire decade, and they were not hiring any graduates at all, in order to keep all of their lifelong employees during the economic crisis.
So this is a double-edged sword here. One, it's great that a company would freeze hiring and try to minimize their costs to keep all of their employees as much as possible. It's very refreshing as opposed to a lot of other places that do like just tons of layoffs. But if that happens on a entire nationwide scale, that is obviously going to have issues, because now you're in a situation where an entire generation, as this entire video is talking about, doesn't have the ability to get a real job that would lead to a real career.
They eventually resumed their hiring in the new century, although finding a job became much harder ever since. But for a whole generation of people who graduated in the 1990s, it was too late. They were not graduates anymore by then, and so the companies would not hire them, as they were hiring fresh graduates instead. Those people, whose only fault was being born at the wrong time, missed their shot and fell through the cracks of the system, and a whole generation, millions of people, were left behind, destined to spend the rest of their lives on temporary part-time low-paid jobs. This period became known as the Employment Ice Age, and people who graduated during that time as the Lost Generation. And since the Japanese economy never fully recovered, more young people graduating in the 2000s and then 2010s joined their ranks, and the period of the last 30 years became collectively known as the Lost Decades. This is obviously tragic for those who are part of the lost generation, but it doesn't affect just them. Instead, their sad fate negatively affects the entire Japanese society, and it casts a dark shadow over Japan's future. There's an entire generation of people, now in their 30s and 40s, who are missing from the job market entirely. They usually live with and often off their parents. They were never economically secure enough to start families of their own, and they never had proper jobs and careers. Around 15% of the population, almost 17 million people, are considered part of the lost generation, and they make up the age group that's the most important for an economy of any country.
Yeah, I mean, that's going to lead to a bunch of people that aren't financially stable enough to have or start a family, and that's going to lead to a population issue, which they are running into now. And there's such a compounding effect of issues that starts to build up here.
The people in their 30s and 40s who usually spend the most on their families, housing, taking mortgages, buying cars, they are those who keep the economic engine going. But in Japan, there's no one to do that now. And economy is not Japan's only problem that's getting worse because of the lost generation. Currently, the country is dealing with what's been called super aging. Japan has the highest percentage of elderly people, almost 30% of the population in the world, and it's aging more rapidly than any other country. And that is partly also because of the millions of children that the lost generation never had. By 2050, the ratio between seniors and people in the working age will be 1 to 1.3, meaning that there will be almost as many people over 65 as people between 15 and 64. In any country in the world, the elderly are dependent on the taxes paid by people in what's called productive age. But in Japan, this will be at some point simply no longer sustainable. And on top of that, the lost generation created another social issue that is becoming increasingly damaging to the survival of the Japanese society, the phenomenon of so-called hikikomori. These are Japanese men who have voluntarily decided to completely cut themselves off of society, and they're spending their lives in complete isolation, never leaving their house and not having any social contacts at all. Usually,
I mean, you have that much societal and cultural pressure, and people are just like not going to deal with it anymore. And you take away the opportunities on top of that, and they're like, all right, screw it. I'm just locking myself away, and this is my life now.
being completely financially dependent on their parents. The first hikikomori were members of the original lost generation, men today in their 30s and 40s who could not fulfill the requirements expected from them by the Japanese society, get a job, climb the career ladder, start a family and provide for them, and decided to give up entirely instead. But eventually they were joined by others from the younger generations as well, who although they did have a chance to join the job market, just found it too stressful and competitive. Today, there is almost 1 million of these men in the Japanese society, with many more on the verge of joining them. And the social phenomenon is quickly becoming a very real mainstream problem, affecting the entire society. The Japanese government is aware of the extremely negative impacts that the existence of the lost generation and the growing number of hikikomori are having on the Japanese society and economy. And it has announced that it will try to help the lost generation to get back up on its feet and reintegrate those who have secluded themselves from the society. But
A lot of people are being very critical of the Japanese government lately because of how little they're actually doing. They are like, hey, we found this solution, but it's not even remotely the actual solution when they should be targeting like actual work culture, which is something they just blatantly don't want to touch on, despite the fact that that is very obviously the main issue. If you deal with the work culture and how things are run as far as people earning a living, that's probably going to solve a lot of the issues. People need to be able to have time to spend with their family or to create a family in the first place. People can't meet other people if they're always working. They can't form relationships. They can't have kids. And they can't do it if they're also financially in a position to be unable to do so. But people that don't have money have kids all the time. So it's really just allow people to have time outside of work and enforce that in some way culturally. Then maybe people will have kids. People will be able to do this. Your society and culture will grow. But they're not going to do that.
so far, it had very little success. The problem is that the Japanese economy is still not doing great, and at the same time, it still has extremely rigid work culture. Not only that people are expected to work extremely long hours and comply with strict hierarchy, but many companies still follow the same pattern of lifelong employment, hiring only once a year and promoting only from within the company, making it impossible for the employees to take breaks or even to get a second chance if they fail to get their foot in the door. And so millions of people are stuck, and their numbers are constantly growing as more young people fail to succeed in the ruthless system, and eventually they just give up.
That's kind of the most poignant way to finish it, is just they just give up.